I love flowers. I love their beautiful, vibrant colors. I love their intoxicating smell. And they're pretty interesting. You may remember from science class the different parts of the flower: the petals, the leaves, the stigma. Yeah, this little tiny stem right here is called the stigma. It has a very important and interesting job for the flower. But as important and interesting as this stigma is, that's not the stigma that we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about stigma, which is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person, and particularly mental health stigma, which is a mark of disgrace, social discrediting, or social disapproval of those with a mental illness. And we're going to talk about how that mental health stigma affects the families and the family caregivers, excuse me, of the mentally ill. But first, let's talk about why is it important to even talk about mental health stigma. Well, consider this. There are approximately 53 million family caregivers in the U.S. alone, with 8.3 million being family caregivers of the mentally ill. So we should talk about it. There may be somebody here who's a family caregiver of someone with mental illness. Another reason to talk about it is that mental health stigma affects many of our communities. Think about the homeless situation. So it's critical that we open up the discussion and talk about this issue head on. I'm affected by mental health stigma because I'm the family caregiver of a loved one with a serious mental illness. So I'm passionate about talking about it and talking about getting rid of stigma. In addition to the family caregiver, family member that I take care of, my mother also has a brain illness. About 55 years ago, she was in a car accident. She was thrown from the car, landed on the sidewalk, and banged her head. About a year after the accident, she started having seizures. And several months after that, she started having behavioral changes. 1 week, she would be singing and dancing and outside with us, playing kickball, riding bikes. And the next week, she would be sitting in the dining room table, playing sad music, smoking cigarettes, and crying. She had 2 doctors, a psychiatrist who said that she was bipolar, and a neurologist who said she wasn't bipolar. He said the accident caused a traumatic brain injury, and that was causing the change in behavior. We didn't know what it was. We just knew our mama was acting different. It was a long, drawn-out process trying to figure out what was going on. But we just needed them to figure it out. But let's come to present day. That was a long time ago. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about my mom's brain injury. And she said, "Oh, I didn't know your mom was in a car accident and had a brain injury. I always thought she was bipolar." And she said it just like that. Matter of fact, no big deal. I love her anyway. But a couple of years ago, I posted a picture of my mom on social media, and I put hashtag traumatic brain injury, hashtag TBI. And so one day, I was at a party, and someone said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know your mom was in a car accident. Poor thing, that's so sad." Girl, I thought she was bipolar. And I was like, wait, where did that come from? You see, one diagnosis was met with empathy and sympathy and compassion. The other diagnosis was met with shunning and negativity. Same person, same behavior, but the different diagnosis provoked a different response. And I remember standing there thinking, this is a great example of mental health stigma. Stigma. Mental health stigma, which causes 38% of people to say they don't want to move next door to someone with a mental illness. 56% to say they don't want to spend the evening socializing with someone with mental illness. 33% who say they don't want to make friends with someone living with mental illness. 58% to say they don't want to work with someone with mental illness. And 68% say that they don't want someone with mental illness to marry into their family. These statistics are from a research study, and I feel like it's so sad, especially knowing what our loved ones go through. I've been a nurse for a long time. I have a family member who has mental illness, so I've talked to many people who are struggling with mental illness, so I know their experience. Such as the lady who was a recovering drug addict, and she told me, when I was on drugs, I saw people walk by me and look at me with disgust. She said, but what they didn't know, I looked at myself with disgust. She said, I don't want to be like that. She told me she wanted out, but the drugs had such a hold on her, she couldn't stop doing drugs. She said it was like living in her own private hell. Or the older gentleman who was an alcoholic, dying of liver cancer and cirrhosis of the liver. And I just asked him, I was like, what caused you to drink to this point? And he said, life, the heartbreaks of life. Or my own family member who I take care of. One morning they had some psychosis. Later in the evening, they said to me, was I tripping earlier today? And I said, yeah, you had some psychosis. And their eyes filled up with tears. And they said to me, why does my brain feel like it can just do whatever it wants to do? And it broke my heart. Because can you imagine not knowing from 1 minute to the next what's going to happen because your behavior is not your control? So while they're trapped in their own private hell, tasked with a brain that doesn't always fire correctly, society is stigmatizing them. Society is saying, I don't want to live next door to them. I don't want them to marry into my family. Criticizing them, judging them, creating shame and embarrassment, calling them names like old alcoholic or druggie or crazy. While they're trying to make sense of this mental pain, society is shunning them. Society is being mean and cruel and treating them as if they don't deserve to be a part of our society. And the impact of mental health stigma is just as troubling. There is another report that said the stigma causes lack of understanding from family, friends, and coworkers, causing alienation. Fewer opportunities for school or work, or trouble getting a job, causing isolation. Financial difficulties, because they can't pay for stuff. Bullying, physical violence, and harassment, creating shame and embarrassment, or worse. Health insurance that doesn't cover all their medicines and doctor appointments, causing financial difficulties again. Or the belief that they're never going to change. This whole situation is just going to stay the same, causing hopelessness. And our loved ones aren't the only ones who suffer from mental health stigma. The families, the family caregivers, they also experience mental health stigma. The family caregivers who are providing food and shelter to their loved ones who cannot work. The family caregivers who are providing transportation to doctor appointments, pharmacy visits, lab visits. The family member who's given medication management and emotional support. Emotional support in an attempt to keep triggers at a minimum so as not to cause any psychosis. The family caregiver who's driving around looking for their homeless loved one to give them food. The family caregiver trying to create a calm and quiet environment in a world that's loud and chaotic. The family caregiver of the mentally ill. The family caregiver like me. We also experience the same isolation, alienation, financial difficulties, and hopelessness as our loved ones. We're isolated because we don't want to tell nobody that our family member has mental illness. We're alienated because when we do tell people, then we're uninvited to the backyard barbecue and other family functions. We have financial difficulties because we're paying for their stuff and our stuff. And we are also hopeless because we don't see an end in sight. So the family caregivers, I call the unsung heroes of mental illness. Those creating compassion in the shadows. The forgotten caregiver. Forgotten because a lot of, most resources are for family caregivers who are taking care of someone who's elderly or has dementia. Very few are specific for family caregivers of the mentally ill. And there's less resources because of institutionalized stigma. There's less funding because even the powers that be don't believe that mental illness is a big deal. And then the families who are taking care of our family members, a lot of times they don't know what's going on. I'm a nurse, so I knew what was going on. A lot of people don't know. So then they think it's just bad behavior. They got a bad teenager, they got a bad kid. They don't understand that it's an illness. So they end up kicking their kids out of the house, and then guess what? Increased homelessness. The other issue is that we just go on and on and on, not talking about it, being quiet about it, and we need to talk about it. So the emotional toll on the family caregivers is just as bad. There's another study that said out of that 53 million caregivers, 40 to 70% have signs and symptoms of depression. And then 25 to 50% of that number go on to have major depression because of just being a caregiver, the stress of being a caregiver. So for those of you who are family caregiver of the mentally ill, I do have some good news for you. There's great strides being made in getting rid of stigma. A lot of stuff is going on, and it's education. Education is the key, because people are afraid of what they don't understand. So once they understand it, they can support the family caregivers, they can empathize with them. Education is the key. Education will let society know that mental illness is an illness, it's a brain illness. It's not a behavior problem. It's an illness just like heart disease or liver disease. And one of the ways that, and if anybody here wants to know, there are resources out there. There aren't a lot, but there's a couple of online sources specifically for stigma, which is deconstructingstigma.org and stampoutStigma.com. Also, some national organizations like the National Alliance of Illness, which is NAMI, which has been instrumental in helping me to do better with learning about it. The National Institute of Mental Health is another good organization. Mental Health America. So there are organizations out there. And if you're an educator or an influencer, please continue to talk about it. Keeping the conversation going. Mental health is being talked about way more than it used to be. So keeping that conversation going is going to help us end stigma. If you are a family caregiver, self-care and self-preservation is so important. You have to take better care of yourself so that you can take better care of your loved one. So important. Keep that conversation going. There's a couple of doctors who have written books that can be very helpful. So the family caregivers, those showing empathy in the shadows, the unsung heroes of mental illness, if we can empower them and advocate for them, it will make everything so much better. Because remember, they're the ones trying to take care of their loved one. They're the ones trying to keep them safe and well. So if we empower them, it's going to trickle down to society. It would just make it much easier for them if we end stigma. I talked a few minutes ago about this stigma, this plant. Plants, as we all know, need nourishment and watering to thrive and flourish. They also need this stigma. And just like this plant, family caregivers also need nurturing and support to thrive and flourish. The only difference is this plant needs this stigma. This stigma is part of the female reproductive system, and it collects pollen. So it's necessary for this flower to thrive. In contrast, stigma is totally unnecessary for the family caregiver. It's detrimental to our society, and it needs to stop. So, before I close, I have a favor to ask everyone. If you're interested in advocating for stigma, just do me this one favor. When you leave here today, or tomorrow, next week, whenever you have a conversation with someone, tell them mental illness is a brain illness. It's an illness, just like heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, diabetes, an illness. It requires a doctor and sometimes medication. It's an illness. Just share that with one person. The second thing you can do is once you share it with that one person, ask them to share it with one other person, that mental illness is a brain illness. And if you do that, we can begin this wave of education that will go on and on and on and help in eradicating stigma. Will you join me?